Hi, so today I'm going to show you how Uni-PIN pens work with watercolour. So I'm going to show you a very simple quick project that how to use your pin pens with watercolour. So I'm just going to do this very simple feather illustration. And one of the things I like working with watercolour and my pin pens, particularly with my watercolour creations, is that I can be quite sort of free and easy with my watercolour and be quite expressive, but then bring in the precision with my pin. What you can see as well is I've already put some pin strokes down just to give my piece a bit of definition. That's to work as a sort of bit of a guide for me. As you can see, I'm working water over it, so, and it's not smudging or damaging the line, which is great. So I'm just going to do this first layer with my, so I'm going to be quite dark with this bit, so you can see that the reason I'm doing this is I want to show you how the pin will still remain true over the dark. And one of the great things about working with a pin with watercolour is that then you can bring out detail that you might not be able to do with a brush and when you're working with watercolour, so that it can really marry up some of the things. So I'm going to just create a sort of kind of a wash here, and you can be quite expressive with your watercolour and be quite sort of painterly, and then you can add in your detail with your pin. So you can see I'm being quite loose here. Okay, and you can see that, as I say, you can work over your pin strokes with some watercolour, and you can also just add water. And you can see, because it's water resistant, I'm not smudging this line, so it's really good to work with, both to work over and, as we'll see, to overlay with your pin. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to dab off any sort of excess sort of bits, because I want this sort of painterly effect, but I don't want it to be too smudgy, so I'm just dabbing it where it's really wet. So I've got quite a sort of nice impressionistic piece here, and now I'm going to go over it with my pin. So the first thing I'm going to do is use some very fine, make some very fine lines with my 0.03 pin. The reason being is that I want to produce a variation in tone. I want something quite delicate, and so I want to sort of have something that truly reflects the character of my feather. So I want something quite fine. You can see that I'm just being very gentle, but you can see that I can already produce a kind of feathery effect just by applying a very light pressure, but then working over the lines with my very fine 0.3. You can see some of the paper's still wet, so I can still work my pin over it. So I'm just gonna, so that's one side, and then I'm just gonna. And what I like to do as well is, and you don't have to do this, but I like to follow the lines sometimes that I've already created with my brush, so I can just bring out various qualities of the painting itself. So this is your pin pen is an incredibly effective tool to bring out what you've already got as well if you're painting. Obviously you can use the pin as well with other water-based paints, so you could use it over Posca if you wanted to use your Posca and dilute your Posca with water. You could work over it with acrylics. it's very easy. Also work over it with some poster paint. So you can see already that this, I'm now producing quite an effective line. So this is one of my fine 0.03. You can see already that even though this is a very fine nib pen, and I can produce little bits and flourishes, you can see that it still works very, very effectively over the watercolour. So I'm going to use a thicker pen now, and I'm going to use the 0.1 and the 0.2 just to bring out a little bit more detail. I don't want to use incredibly thick pens on this area here because I still want it to retain its lightness. It is, after all, a feather. So I'm using my 0.1 here. I'm just doing some little darker lines for emphasis. You can see the contrast between 0.3, but it just brings that out. I don't want to be too heavy-handed, because this is a very, very light, small feather, so I want to retain its character. But I do want to have that contrast of line just to add a little bit of depth, and that's why I'm going to use the 0.2. I just want a very subtle contrast. I don't want anything too over the top, but I want that flourish. So I want to be able to I want a subtle variation of line. I don't want anything too contrasty, and I don't want anything to be too jarring. So that's why I've used just pens on the very thinner end of the spectrum, but you can still see that I can still have this contrast. And I'm not particularly using any particular lines or artistic techniques there. I'm just simply using pen strokes, very, very subtle pen strokes. So I'm just still going to continue with my 0.2. I'm just going to again come back to my 0.3 just for a little bit more subtlety. You can see the difference. 0.03, sorry. You can see the difference in my tone and variation between the two. So then I've got a bit more going on. I want a bit more movement here. I'm just going to be very light here. And then I'll just use a 0.1 actually, just for a tiny bit more variation here and here. Add a little bit more definition. As I say, I'm not using any particular drawing strokes such as stippling or cross-hatching. I'm just simply going with the flow and using just very simple brush strokes. And I'm going to just go up here, and then we're going to use some thicker nibs to work this larger area up. So I'm going to make use of my brush pen for these darker areas, just because I want something with a bit more flourish, because this is darker. So you can see I'm working the brush pen on an angle, so I'm still keeping again that spirit. And what I can do as well is I can work on the tip here just to integrate these lines in, so it's not so jarring when I come up here, so it just looks like a subtle move rather than a big move. So I can just create a little bit more subtlety and variation, and again just working with the shape that I've already created with my watercolour, just to add a bit more depth. And again, when I want a bit more variation, I can just work that pen on its tip. I can start just producing a bit more variation in line. You can see that you can create a beautiful sort of very sort of painterly effect with your brush nib. So this is with the darker tones. Again, if I want to really give this area a lot of coverage, I can cross hatch. You can see I'm cross hatching here, which is a very simple technique. It's just you go make some lines with your pen and then you just go over that line like so. That produces something a bit thicker and a bit more textural. Now I just want to marry that and make that a bit more elegant by using the tip and drawing that in. I'm going to just do that here. I can now, in a minute, I'm going to use my thinner pins to just join this all together so it doesn't look so jarring. So I've got my thicker areas here. I can just add a few thick areas just to marry this area up so that there's some unity and there's a bit more sort of movement. I'll just use some thinner pens. So I'm going to use my thinner nibs, my 0.1 and my 0.03. And with the 0.03 I'm just going to make some very, very fine lines so that this kind of joins the dot, but it joins the dots in a very subtle way. There's not big, thick, heavy lines. And it, again, you know, keeps the integrity of the actual thing that you're drawing. You know, you've got these feathers are made up of very, very fine lines. So you've got a bit of I'm just going to use my 0.1 just to emphasise again the centre, that was all coming from one centre. Again, I can just make some darker lines with my 0.01. So I've really used the watercolour here as a wash and as a foundation for my piece, and I can just now start, just bring it all together. And you've seen how we've been able to work up our watercolour to go over the pin and for the pin to go over the watercolour. So you can apply this technique, as I say, to many, many drawings. I hope that is a good illustration of how to work your pins over watercolour.